Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. It's good to see all of you diehards coming during the holiday season. I also want to wish all of you happy holidays, safe holidays in terms of your travel, and enjoy your family and friends during the next week or two. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dan Matlock to you. Dan is an associate professor of medicine in geriatrics who has an unusual but a very rich path of training. He received his bachelor's degree in engineering from the Colorado State of Mines, then came here and got an MD as well as an MPH at the University of Colorado. Went on to house staff training at the University of Colorado, and then developed a research fellowship in health services research, more broadly based. He ended up getting boarded in medicine, geriatrics, and palliative care, and has developed a very, very interesting career that focuses on how you make decisions when faced with life-threatening medical problems, and maybe even a little bit about how you influence those decisions in ways that are completely inform the patient and inform the provider in a way that doesn't push someone too strongly in one direction or another. He has been funded by the VA hospital, NIH, PCORI, and has a number of collaborative projects with a variety of people throughout the medical center. As I mentioned, his research focuses on decision support for patients with life-threatening problems. He's published in JAMA Internal Medicine, and a very prominent a journal that not all of you are probably familiar with, a journal called Medical Decision Making, which is actually a great journal that carries a lot of this type of work. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dan to you. Every time I listen to him, I learn a lot about this topic. I think it's an incredibly difficult topic as we deal with any of our patients with chronic diseases. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks. All right, thanks. Can you hear me? All right. Just check the clicker here. I'll use the mouse. All right, so what was missing from that introduction is I met my wife in high school, and she's not leaving Colorado. That's one of the threads here. And all three of my daughters had kindergarten in the same classroom where I had kindergarten. So I'm very local to this state. Oh, I had to turn it on. Thank you. All right, so the title of my talk is Patient Decision Making in Heart Failure, T1 to T4. And Frank, one of the chiefs, came up to me before, and he was like, I've been getting asked a lot today, what is T1 through T4? None of the residents really know what that means. Is it like a new classification of heart failure or something? And it's not, and I'll go through a little bit more of what it is as we get into the talk, but it's about translational research, and I want to show that decision-making actually has aspects in all types of translational research, and we'll talk about that, and that's kind of how I've outlined this talk. Some conflicts of interest. You heard some of the funding I've had. Recently, I've received some contracts from the American College of Cardiology to develop some decision aids, and I'm not a cardiologist, but I'm actually a member of the American College of Cardiology. And I put this on there. I hadn't joined for a long time because it was so expensive to join. And they made a rule a few years ago that a geriatrician can join for $125. But I had to fill out an application. Fred Masudi and Larry Allen wrote me a letter of recommendation. And then on the application here, I had to check a box that I was either a CV veterinarian or a geriatrician. So I don't know what that says about the American College of Cardiology, but it's really nice of them to allow me to be a member at a discount rate. So an overview of this talk in decision making. This T1 through T4 is one of the ways people always talk about translational research and what is translational research. And this is just one of the ways people categorize different types of translational research. And very simply, T1 is sort of bench research getting translated to the bedside. T2 is bedside research getting translated to patients. T3 is patients getting translated to practice. And T4 is practice getting translated to policy. Just very simply. And so the outline of my talk is going to talk about decision-making research in these 4 domains and some of the work that we've done in our group. So I'll start with bench research and decision science. Before I get into this, I want you to think of this quote. There's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. Now, imagine you're trying to explain this to, say, an 8-year-old. And what words would you give them? And I used to give a talk to the med students, and I would ask them to articulate it, and it just got too embarrassing. So I stopped doing that, because it's really hard to articulate what this means when you try to explain it. So Gerd Gigerenzer, he's a psychologist, he asked 750 people on the street, what does it mean if there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow? And he gave them 3 options. It will rain tomorrow in 30% of the region, it will rain tomorrow for 30% of the time, or it will rain on 30% of the days like tomorrow. And the most common answer was it will rain on 30% of the days like tomorrow, or it will rain tomorrow for 30% of the time. The right answer is it will rain on 30% of the days like tomorrow. But some of the comments I think are pretty interesting. 3 out of 10 meteorologists believe it will rain. Or 30% means that if you look up at the sky and see 100 clouds, 30 of them are black. It's not about time. It indicates the amount of rain that will fall. Or if we had 100 lives, it would rain in 30 of these tomorrow. So this gets into one of the problems with decision making, is that people just have a pretty poor understanding of numbers. Physicians included. There's research that physicians sometimes misunderstand these things. I think this is a great example to show how this can go terribly, terribly badly. So in 1995, the United Kingdom Committee on Safeties of Medicines issued this warning. Oral contraception pills increase the risk of potentially life-threatening blood clots by 100%. And this is from the New England Journal. This is rates of abortions. I don't want to make a social comment about abortions, but I think we can all agree they're a proxy measure for unwanted pregnancies. And you look at the years on the bottom, 1990 to 2000 and 1995, in the UK there was a huge increase in abortions. And they also saw a huge increase in unwanted pregnancies as well. And the actual increase, 1 in 7,000 to 2 in 7,000, which is indeed a 100% relative risk increase. But it's a 0.014 absolute risk increase. And this is where statistics can get really complicated, and you can see some of the consequences there with additional abortions and births. And the irony is the risk of blood clots with pregnancy is about 10-fold higher than the risk of the medicine. So what's the problem with numbers? One of the problems is this psychologists have coined this denominator neglect. Anytime we hear a percentage, we neglect that the denominator is 1 in 7,000 out of 2 in 7,000. We automatically in our brains put 100 as the denominator. So we hear a relative risk, and we assume it's an absolute risk. And that's just a cognitive bias in our brains that we do if we don't think about it closely. And I give talks on this, and I understand this, and then sometimes I'll be listening to a story on NPR, and they'll throw out a statistic, and I'm sitting there wondering, trying to figure out, are they talking about a relative or an absolute risk here? Because it's often even not clear to me listening to these stories. And journals have gotten a lot better, but there's some great articles about how abstracts from the 90s and even early 2000s in major journals like the New England Journal and JAMA, they would often present the benefits as a relative risk, a 20% reduction in stroke, and the harms as absolute risks, but a 1% increase in bleeding. And that's basically comparing an apple and an orange. It's basically impossible to know what the risk-benefit trade-off is between those things. And journals actually are onto this now, and they're much better about it. They're much better about presenting absolute risks. But it's a problem. Just to get into some of our research around this, this is from the New England Journal trial. This is the data from the SCUD-HEF trial. This is the major primary prevention trial for implantable defibrillators, which is a therapy that we've done a lot of work with. And it basically showed over 60 months or 5 years, with people with the defibrillator, which is the green arm, had about a 7% absolute risk reduction in death. And this was primary prevention patients, class 2, 3 heart failure. This is what convinced Medicare to decide to cover defibrillators. And just for interest. At the time they started this trial in 1999, there was a question of, is an antiarrhythmic as good as a defibrillator? And that's the blue arm, amiodarone, and you can see the amiodarone was as good as placebo. So that question was kind of answered. That's almost of historical interest. So we surveyed every defibrillator patient at Kaiser, Colorado, and asked them if 100 people like you had a defibrillator, how many lives would be saved over the next 5 years? And we gave them a few choices. And you can see their responses here. Very few said 0. A couple said 1. A few got the right answer. I just told you, 7%, 7 out of 100, 7% absolute risk reduction. But most people overestimated the benefits of the defibrillator. And I think this is partially due to the relative risks. It's partially due to some other things, I think, that we may get into, framing effects and such, that I'll get into here shortly. But I think this is part of the problem. If we use relative risk with patients, we'll confuse them. So in my practice, and I think something we can all take, I've really tried to avoid ever using a percentage with a patient. And instead, I try to use a natural frequency. I don't say, oh, there's a 5% risk of myopathy with a statin medication. Instead, I might say, about 5 out of 100 people like you may start having some muscle aches. And patients are much more likely to understand it the second way than the first way because the percentages are confusing. So if you take nothing else, that's something you can take into practice now to help your patients understand things better. Just to get into some of the other challenges with decision making, even beyond numbers, because I believe that you'll feel this as I talk, I believe that we need to do a good job informing our patients and do a better job making sure they understand things, but it's really challenging. This is a really cool experiment, not in the medical space, with jars of jams. This is from a psychologist at Columbia. And they did this study in a grocery store where on one day they would put this display out with 24 jars of jams. And then on the other days they would put this display out with 6 flavors of jams. And when they had the 24 flavors, 60% of people stopped to look, but only about 3% actually picked one. And when they had the 6 jams, fewer people stopped to look because it's not as pretty, less of a rainbow, but more people were likely to buy one. And people generally had greater satisfactions when the options were limited. And you see this in lots of settings. This gets into some of the behavioral economics. Our default is to avoid cognitive effort in decision making. So if we can simplify decisions, it makes it easier. And I think this gets into one of our jobs as clinicians when we talk to patients. If you just give patients a lot of options and put it on the table, you could actually be doing some harm and not actually helping them, even though your intentions are very good. So here's a study with physicians. This was published in JAMA, demonstrating sort of the same point. Physicians were asked, they said, you have this 67-year-old farmer with arthritis. You've tried all these NSAIDs and they're not working, so you're going to send him to orthopedics to consider a hip replacement. This comes up a lot in my seniors clinic. And then half of the physicians got the option on the left and the other half got the option on the right. But there's one NSAID this patient has not tried. What do? Refer and start ibuprofen, the one you haven't tried, or refer and do not start any medication. And then the other half of physicians got an additional option where there's 2 NSAIDs you haven't tried. Refer and start ibuprofen, refer and start piroxicam, or refer and do not start any medication. And the physicians who had more choices were more likely not to start any medication and just refer, which is sort of counterintuitive. This is that cognitive bias. Once we had to make a choice, now all of a sudden it got harder. And these are physicians. If we just said, oh, there's only one thing to try, then you don't have to think about it. Let's try the ibuprofen and go see orthopedics. But once you had to make a decision, it's like, forget it. Just go see orthopedics. It's pretty interesting. So these are some of the kinds of studies that these people won the Nobel Prize for, doing research for what is commonly called behavioral economics. They're actually both not economists, they're cognitive psychologists. But Dan Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, I believe, and he shared it with Amos Tversky. And Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize in economics last year. And both of these are great books, highly accessible. I like them both a lot. I like Thinking Fast and Slow better, but if you only have time to read one, Nudge is a little bit more accessible. But I definitely recommend reading these books just to understand some of these concepts around how we make decisions, because I think it has a lot of applications into what we do every day with patients. And this is another one of their more common things that they've studied. That they actually, this is one of the studies that actually led to them winning the Nobel Prize. And one of the theories is this idea of framing effects. And this is what, for lack of a better phrase, they called the Asian flu crisis. I'm sure that's not the most PC term, but that's what they called it back in 1981. But this is also a study of physicians. I think these were medical students. But they said, imagine that the United States is preparing for this outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. And then half the docs got the top framing, half the docs got the bottom framing. And you see these are identical, except in how they're framed. In the top, program A, 200 people will be saved. In the bottom, program A, 400 people will die. In the top, program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved. And in the bottom, it was the same thing, but framed as die. So it's a gain frame, loss frame. The top is the gain frame, the bottom is the loss frame. And the only difference between A and B, they're mathematically identical in expected utility theory. 200 is 1/3 of 600. It's just one is risky and one is not. So that's the difference. And then you see here, when physicians were given program A framed as a gain, they chose the risk-averse option. And when it was framed as a loss, 3/4 of them chose the risk-seeking option. And this is something that has been reproduced over and over in our psychology, that we tend to be risk-averse when faced with gains, and we tend to be risk-seeking when faced with losses. And you can start thinking about, how does this apply to medicine, and what we do and how we frame things to patients could very heavily influence the decisions that they make. And this gets into like the gain frame thing. This gets into why we buy insurance. You pay $100 for a Blu-ray player, and then Best Buy says, well, you want to pay $15 more to insure it for a year. Well, you just gained this Blu-ray player, so now you're risk averse, and $15 of insurance feels like a small thing. You're basically saying you think this thing has a 15% chance of dying in the next year. If you think that, why are you buying that Blu-ray player? And those insurance, that's the highest profit margin thing for Best Buy. Like, just insure that yourself. But this is the behavior that causes those kinds of decisions to be made. So we looked at this. We tried to, one of the problems with all this psychology stuff is a lot of these experiments are done very hypothetically. And we've been trying to figure out how to look at this more in actual medicine, in clinical encounters. So this is a study where we explored, this also has problems, but we had interviewed a whole lot of patients looking at their decision-making for defibrillators. And we decided to explore some of these concepts and see if we could see these in these interviews. We did a framework, it's a qualitative framework analysis. And we saw some evidence of framing from these interviews. So this is a quote from a patient. And then my doctor, the cardiologist I was seeing, was over there, and he explained to me, after a massive heart attack like that, your chances of having an event that can kill you is 15% a year. And he said, that don't sound like much, but he says, when you start going 3 or 4 or 5 years out, it's pretty high. And I figured, okay, so basically said, ICD or you die. So I chose the ICD, of course. And then we asked about, well, did doctors talk about any of the downsides or deactivation? And those tended to be minimized. We never had that discussion, deactivation, with them. I've wondered if they would ever ask that, but because they never brought it up, I didn't think I should worry about it too much. And so this is, and I think clinicians, even in a well-meaning way, we frame things to patients that can influence decisions a lot. And this is just some evidence of how we've seen this in some of our work. So that kind of gets through some of the T1. I think that's sort of the basic science of decision-making, is what's going on in the psychology in the brain. Is there a clock in this room? I just want to make sure I don't... Oh, there it is, 12:18 in the back. It's small. All right, we're in good shape. All right, so moving on to T2. How do we actually take these decision principles and get into the clinic? And a lot of the work we do is in shared decision-making. This is just one strategy that we've tried to improve decision-making. And this is where a lot of the grants and work that we've done have been in this space. I like this cartoon a lot because this is not shared decision-making. This is sort of an awful type of decision-making where you're just throwing options at patients and letting them decide. So just how do I define shared decision-making? There's quite a few definitions of it. My favorite comes from 1985, where they called it a meeting between experts. And I really like that definition because it basically acknowledges that you have a clinician who's an expert in the medical science and then a patient who's an expert in themselves and what's important to them. And if you see each other as experts, then you can really start sharing a decision. And you can, we're familiar with these other ends of the spectrum. There's the paternalism, where the doctor just tells the patient what to do. And then there's the other end, where you just give the patient options and tell them to decide. And Timothy Quill wrote a great article in Annals of Internal Medicine where he actually called that type of decision-making patient abandonment. That's not a clinician sharing a decision with a patient at all, in my opinion. That's just kind of telling the patient to do it and releasing yourself from any liability, which is not really our job as a clinician. So what do we do in our shop on this? This is a busy slide. I don't want to go into it. I just wanted to show a little bit. We've written about how we design and test these tools for shared decision-making, and I just wanted to show a couple things here. Oh, you can't really see the pointer. Maybe you can see this. Yeah, here we go. So we do a lot of research understanding a decision. What are the decision needs? And then we start drafting tools and we iterate. We do very much a user-centered design approach where we talk to patients and clinicians and really try to design something that fits for both. I think there's a lot of research in decision aids that we can talk about, but a lot of decision aids are sitting on shelves, and we don't want to be a shop that makes decision aids that sit on shelves. So we design for both patients and clinicians. And sometimes we break theoretic rules in order to get something that people are willing to use. That's kind of how we'll move into the T3 and implementation, but designing to make something that's actually useful to people. But I just want to show these circles. There's a lot of iterative work, and the big things that we try to get is we try to make sure these tools are accurate, understandable, and unbiased. And this unbiased is by far the hardest piece. It's so easy to have one phrase or one quote or something make the tool feel like it's trying to push or discourage a decision tool. I'll tell you, most of the tools we make, the clinicians think we're trying to discourage patients from getting the tool, and the patients think we're trying to encourage them to get the tool. And almost once we get to that point, we think we're somewhere close to the middle. But it's hard. So do decision aids work? Absolutely they work. There's a Cochrane review of 115 trials of decision aids, and almost universally they improve knowledge, they improve value treatment concordance, they improve patient-doctor communication, they improve patients' involvement in the decisions, they improve satisfaction, they lower decision conflict, they lower decision regret, and they lower the proportion of people undecided. The problem with a lot of these trials is these are all highly controlled efficacy studies where a research assistant is enrolling patients, and it's actually not that hard to take a patient who didn't understand their decision, show them something, and then they understand it better. What I'll get into in the T3 space is actually how do you make that happen in the real world practice with busy clinicians? I think that's where the real hard question is. But just to give you just little snapshots of some of the tools we've made, this is from our defibrillator tool, and you can see this data here. This is the same data I showed you earlier from the SCUDHEF trial, presented as an icon array or pictograph. And there's data that if you show patients statistics like this, there's that 7 out of 100 absolute risk reduction, they're more likely to answer a knowledge question correct 2 weeks later than if I had shown them percentages or natural frequencies. So we use some of those kinds of risk communication tools in the tools we develop. Also, it's not just about the numbers, it's also about trade-offs and framing. And you can see here we've tried to frame both getting an ICD and not getting an ICD as both reasonable options. We use patient quotes to do that. I'm not ready to die. I have so much I'm trying to stay alive for. Even if it means getting shocked, I'm willing to do anything I can to help me live longer. It's a very reasonable reason to get an ICD. Or I've had a good life. The idea of dying quickly sounds like a painless way to go. I've always said I hope to die in my sleep. Going through surgery and getting shocked is not the kind of thing I want. Also a very reasonable option for somebody. So trying to frame these things not as get the ICD or die, but you have path 1 and path 2. Potentially both are reasonable, and what's right for you is what's really right here. We've done some videos and interactive websites. You may recognize Fred Masudi. He's been the narrator in a lot of our videos. He's an excellent narrator. Paul Verosi is an electrophysiologist over at the VA. He's incredibly articulate in these videos, just talking about these trade-offs. And then these are some of the patients that we have as clips in our video talking about their experiences. We've done some work with the LVADs. Larry Allen I've worked really closely with, and Colleen McElvin, and both sitting back there. And we spent several years developing this tool, and I'll show you some of the results of this coming up in the T3 section. We also try to not just focus on the numbers again, but talk about other aspects of the decision making. We try to use some of the communication teachings and skills from palliative care to talk about tough things. So in our LVAD tool, we say things like, many patients like you have found this scary or confusing. Some patients have felt pressured. So using that normalizing language to help people get past an emotional reaction and into a cognitive space. These emotions are normal. And that came from our pre-work, that patients were really scared. And so we couldn't just start throwing numbers at a patient who's really scared. That's not going to help them make a decision. So we didn't want to ignore some of these emotions they were having. That's one of the ways that our group is trying to be a little unique in the shared decision-making space, to combine some of these communication principles with some of the numeracy and risk communication principles. We've got working cardiac procedures. I mentioned we have some contracts with the ACC. We have to work with advanced heart failure and LVADs. We've done a little bit of work with Carmen Lewis in colon cancer. And then we're also starting to get into some work in hospice. And how do we support patients making a hospice decision? It's interesting, a lot of the tools that are out there for hospice are also very biased. And trying to develop a balanced hospice tool. You know, hospice is not for everybody. It's good at the right time when it's right. But you don't want to oversell and underdeliver. So that's been an interesting project to also work on. These are some of the tensions we feel in our shop. We try to do this user-centered design, but that often goes against some of the underlying decision theory. I remember one of the first defibrillator tools I made, one of the cardiologists said, I would never show that to my patient. And it was perfectly balanced risk communication. I went on all the principles, and it showed the 7 out of 100 benefit, and then it showed 7 out of 100 having some complication. And he's like, those are basically apples and oranges. So even though the decision-making world says this is the right way to do it, when I showed it to the end users, they said, no way, that's not the right way to do it. So we modified our tool. We actually lost a point on that tool in the International Decision Aid Standards for designing it for implementation. But I think we did the right thing by designing a tool that's actually going to fit what the clinicians need. And then also this recently with these contracts from the ACC, this tension between being a rigorous scientist and academic and then trying to be a good business partner and finish the projects we said we're going to finish. Academics is very slow and business is very fast, but academics is careful and rigorous and business is often rushing to a product. And we want to work with these groups in order to have something that has some impact. But those are just tensions we feel. Just put them out there. It's interesting to think about. So moving into T3, this is a slide I stole from Russ Glasgow. We don't want to do the bench to bookshelf kind of research. This is now the practice or the patient to practice. How do we actually move what we're doing with shared decision making at the patient level and get it into practice? And this is where I've migrated a lot more recently in my career into the implementation science space, because those are the methods I've needed in order to actually do the work that I want to do in this shared decision making world. So implementation is really hard. Just back to the decision aid, there's all kinds of questions that I can design the best decision aid, but then who's going to deliver it? The provider, a staff member? Is that staff member going to be empowered to have these discussions? How is it going to be delivered? Is it going to be electronic? Is it going to be in person or mailed? If it's electronic, am I going to get the EHR to sing for me? That's kind of a tough thing to do on this campus if anybody's tried. The patient portal, or am I going to use email? All kinds of different questions come up when you actually try to get something from the patient to practice. Also, different medical decisions require different depths of deliberation. Our LVAD video is 26 minutes long. Our colon cancer tool is 1 page with 2 minutes long because it's completely different decisions. We had patients in the LVAD say, I wish it was longer. I want to hear from more patients. And getting somebody who's thinking about colon cancer screening to even watch a 2-minute video is a monumental challenge compared to getting somebody in the ICU to watch a 26-minute video for an LVAD. It's just a completely different question. Excuse me. And then when, this is another challenge. If people are making a decision, but when are they in their head actually making that decision? When is that decision window, they call it? For the defibrillators, we kind of hypothesized that there's a referral from a primary care doc to a cardiologist and from a cardiologist to an electrophysiologist, and we have tried to implement our tools in this window in between. And is that the decision window? I imagine not for every patient. Some patients probably decide up here. Some patients may be deciding here. But that's, once you start trying to actually do something in the real world, these kind of very practical questions come up, and they're really hard to answer. So there was a systematic review of implementation science, and the authors, you can see the title here, Many Miles to Go. And they concluded that clinicians lack significant confidence in the content of the decision aids to use them. That's one of the reasons we're trying to work with the ACC. There's some data that clinicians are more likely to trust a tool if it's endorsed by their specialty society. There were many concerns about the decision aids disrupting workflows. I know in primary, I do research in this space, and when I'm 30 minutes behind in clinic, my shared decision discussions become a lot worse. My PSA discussion, it gets pretty abridged. And that's just being honest, because it's hard. It's a really hard job. And then they mentioned that there's lack of incentives, and that's a major barrier. So back to the LVAD. I'm stealing a lot of slides from Larry Allen here because he makes really good slides. So thank you, Larry. This is the LVAD is sort of the modern version of the artificial heart. This is the thing that Vice President Cheney had before he got his heart transplant. For those who don't know, this is basically a partial artificial heart. I don't want to get into the clinical stuff of it too much, but I want to get into the decision aspects of it. But this has been a growing therapy over the past few years. In 2009, it was approved as destination therapy. Previously, it was a bridge to transplant therapy, but now it's approved for people who are never going to be eligible for a transplant. And since then, it's been increasing pretty quickly. It's now more common than a heart transplant, in fact. And we did a review. We looked at existing tools that were out there to support shared decision-making. We had a great medical student, Matt Iacovetto, did a summer project with us, and he found 77 tools. And he reviewed those tools, and very few of them talked about the risks. Only one of them introduced the idea of palliative care or hospice. Most of them talked about the benefits. We had a panel come in and review some of the tools. They felt like they were very biased towards getting the LVAD. So there wasn't really any good tools existing out there. So that's where we spent some time developing this decision aid, and we just finished this PCORI-funded LVAD trial, and I'll show you some of the results of this trial. But just to outline this trial briefly, our objective of this trial was to both understand the effectiveness and the implementation of a shared decision support intervention in advanced heart failure patients, considering an LVAD. And I'll talk a little bit about how we looked at both of those at the same time, but it was a true implementation trial. So we thought of different study designs for this trial. We have this decision aid, and there's this team of people who work with patients with an LVAD. And we thought, well, classic patient-level randomization, that's not a great idea, because there's this team already delivering the education, and shared decision-making is not just at the patient. It's really this dyadic or triadic, or the team and the patient and family together. If we randomized at the patient level, I think diffusion would have been pretty high. We couldn't afford more than about 6 sites, so a classic cluster randomized trial, which is a nice way to handle some of the diffusion effects, wasn't great here because we'd only have 3 sites in the intervention and 3 sites in the control. So we did a step wedge cluster trial. This is one of these quasi-experimental designs, but it's a way to get some data on effectiveness and some data on implementation at the same time. Basically what it is, you still randomize, but you randomize when each site gets the intervention. So you randomize the rollout of it. And then you can study implementation at all 6 sites, because all 6 sites are getting it. But at the site level, it just kind of looks like a pre-post trial. You start collecting data here, and then at some point in there, you implement the intervention, and then you keep collecting the same data, and you see if there are differences. But by randomizing when those sites get the intervention, theoretically, it's a way to control for some secular trends. I'm not sure after having done it if that's completely true. It maybe partially does, but I think there's still weaknesses to this design. I think there were weaknesses to all the designs we could have chosen for this trial. There's a lot of strengths to this design, too, in that it does allow us to study implementation at all 6 sites, and none of the other sites would have really done that. We used Russ Glasgow's REAIM framework for our evaluation. We evaluated the REACH proportion of eligible patients getting it. Was it effective? Did the sites adopt it, and did the clinicians at the site adopt it? How was it implemented, and was it consistently used? And then we interviewed all the sites at the end to see if, now that we're done, there's no more money coming to you, are you still going to use the intervention? Which is really what we want. If you're going to spend all this time implementing something, did you actually make it a new practice for that site? Is it a standard of care? That's really what we kind of hope to see. So we did a very focused implementation intervention. this is another challenge. One of the aha moments for me in implementation science is you have your effectiveness intervention, the decision aids we make, but then you also have your implementation intervention. And there's lots of ways you could implement. We could have somebody go to the site and train people. We could have facilitation. We could do audit and feedback. And this is where the science of implementation comes in, is studying different ways to implement things. In this trial, we designed sort of a very low-touch implementation. Larry and Colleen flew to each site and gave a grand rounds, did some communication training, and they discussed this new process. And then after implementation, I went to each site and did a follow-up visit and interviewed people to find out how things were going with Jocelyn Thompson, one of our research assistants. And then we had sort of monthly calls and ongoing site support. And that's it. That's all we did for the implementation of this. So just some of the, just to show some of the results of this trial, we're just getting the results. Larry Allen presented these as a late breaker at the AHA last month. I'll share some of that with you now. But what is our primary outcome? Is this outcome of decision quality. So what is a quality decision? You have a quality decision really has two domains. If we use the IOM's definition of an informed patient making a decision consistent with their values, measure if they're informed, and then measure value concordance. So knowledge, if you improve knowledge, that's one way to do it, and then can you improve value concordance? So ideally, we'd like to take people from low knowledge, low value concordant decisions and move them to high knowledge, high value concordant decisions. And that's just a definition of decision quality. How do we measure? Knowledge is easy to explain. How do we measure value concordance? Oh, some of the text got messed up there. We had people put an X on a line between what would their preference be? Do everything I can to live longer, even if that means having major surgery and being dependent on a machine, or live with whatever time I have left without going through major surgery or being dependent on a machine. And we had people place an X on this line. So if they place an X down here, an LVAD would be the concordant choice. If they place an X down here, no LVAD would be the value concordant choice. That's how we measured it. And then this would be the discordant choice. So we looked at that. We enrolled over the 2 years. We enrolled 248 patients at 6 sites around the country. There were really no differences in groups, except in the intervention arms, patients tended to be in the Intermax 4 through 7 score more. All sites went through the training. At each of the sites, anywhere from 31 to 72 staff at each site went through the training. 88% of people received the pamphlet decision aid. 92% received the video decision aid. So we didn't have study staff delivering decision aids to any of these patients. We had the clinicians. That was one of our rules. The clinicians had to be the one delivering the patient. So 92% of patients got the decision aids, even with the clinicians delivering it, which is really good reach in our impression. And patients liked the materials, but they did feel that the tools were biased towards LVAD. In the control group, when they're getting industry materials, 54% of patients thought they were biased towards LVAD. And in the intervention group, 43% still thought they were biased towards the LVAD when they're seeing our materials. So how did we do in our primary outcome? We did improve knowledge. This was modest but statistically significant. In the control group, it went from about 60% to 65%. In the intervention group, it went from 60% to 70%. So we had about a 5% increase in knowledge with our intervention. And we had a pretty large increase in value concordance, where in the control group, 0.17 were concordant by this Kindle's Tau concordant. In the intervention group, that went up to 0.48. So our difference in the correlation coefficient was 0.28, which is pretty good. So we were pretty excited to see these results, that we were able to improve both knowledge and value concordance in this intervention. Secondarily, we saw a 26% decrease in the rate of LVADs, which is sort of an interesting piece of this. And I'm not sure, this is now the problem of that step wedge design. I'm not sure how much of this is to our intervention. I think over the course of the trial, physicians may have had changing attitudes towards LVADs in general, starting to see some of the complications as they put more and more in. And when we heard in our exit interviews, there was some more ambivalence. It was kind of interesting. We talked to the docs, and the docs would say, yeah, we're trying to grow our programs, we're trying to do more outreach, but I would never want to put one of these in a patient who doesn't completely understand what they're getting into. And it was really interesting because in other areas of shared decision-making, I didn't hear quite that much sort of enthusiasm about the shared decision-making aspect, which I thought was pretty interesting in this context. So this is an interesting piece, and as we move forward to our next scope of work, we're going to try to implement our tool at all LVAD sites around the country. There are 162. We're working on a grant now to propose that. I'm wondering how much of this will be a barrier as we go out to some of these other sites that weren't sort of our friends buying into our first 6-site study. So I'm getting to the end here, just a few more slides. So moving on to the T4, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the policy space. But this is really what gets me excited. I constantly am finding myself wondering, how do we change this culture in medicine so that it is more patient-centered and also works with what clinicians are trying to do. I think this gets into how do you change guidelines, how do you change quality measures, how do you change Medicare reimbursement and other policies. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I get into that, this is one of the quotes from one of my early qualitative studies that really changed how I thought about this whole construct. This was a doc being asked around implanted defibrillators, and he said, I think my biggest concern is if I convey the risk to them too strongly, they will choose or make an unwise decision and not proceed with therapy. And this came up in multiple clinician interviews, and so we actually called this a theme. And I call this paternalism, but I think it's paternalism in the best sense of the word. This is sort of a feeling I have when I protect my daughters from some bad story on the news. So it's not evil at all. And this was a salaried doc. This doc didn't get paid more for putting these in. This was just a belief that this is really the right thing for this patient. So in the geriatric world, geriatricians can be a little tough sometimes. And I get frustrated when I hear people say, oh, docs are just doing these things for the money, because I just don't think that's true at all. I think with rare exception, everybody's trying to do what's right by patients, even when we get to these different decisions. And so this was really helpful for me to get this sort of understanding early on. And, I was an engineer as an undergrad. I'm a quantitative-minded person. But I've definitely learned more from qualitative research than anything I've done, because it's changed the way I see and perceive things. And this has been helpful for me as I go out and talk to audiences of cardiologists, because it's real, it's something we all feel, and it's also disarming to kind of say everybody's trying to do what's right here. I don't think that's right, though. And this is a survey we did of the American College of Cardiology. We surveyed 1,200 cardiologists, and we asked, to what extent do the following factors affect your recommendations regarding ICDs for primary prevention of sudden death? And we gave them a list. And we scored those. It was on a Likert scale, and we scored it from 0 to 4. And you see mortality data and guidelines were 3.8, 3.6 out of 4. But you look down here, patient preferences, 2.9 out of 4. Patient's understanding, 2.2 out of 4. And back to where I was arguing what is a good shared decision, I think there kind of is a right answer here, where you have mortality data and guidelines should be near 4 out of 4, as should sort of the patient's preferences and understanding. And if you kind of bring those things together, then you're really doing good shared decision making. I don't think you necessarily need a decision aid to do that. I think it's really a philosophical thing that we can all do. And this is sort of the consequence of that. This is a great quote from a health affairs paper by Dominic Frosch, where they surveyed patients about why they had focus groups of patients about why they had trouble challenging their doctors or asking their doctors. And this is a quote from a patient who said, I didn't ever challenge my doctor because he says, is the guy going to be pissed at me for not doing what he wanted? Will he do what I want but resent it and therefore not be quite as good or in some way detrimental to my quality of care? And these same focus groups, the patient said things like, I'm scared of being labeled a difficult patient. So these are, we have this power differential. Patients come to us and they don't really want to question us because they're scared of that for some reason. And then you get this, and this is, BMJ is a great journal, and this was the cover from the BMJ, Let the Patient Revolution Begin. And when I first saw this, I was like, oh, great. And I opened it up, and there's all these articles that were topics I was interested in. And then a few years ago, I went to the International Shared Decision-Making meeting in Peru, and there was one of the keynote speakers was a Peruvian ICU doc who'd spent his whole year working in human rights. And he puts this slide up, and he talks about how awful this is. And he says, look at this iconography. Think of how much suffering happened in this, related to this iconography in the last century. He's like, this is not what patients want. This is certainly not what we want as clinicians. We don't want to be on the receiving end of a revolution. Every study of patients says they want to trust their doc. They want a relationship with their doc. No study of patients says they want to revolt against their doc. So if we don't do better, this is kind of the consequence we're asking for if we don't start changing some things about this, in my opinion. But I do think things are changing. I think we're starting to break the guideline armor and see some difference. And this is the 2013 guidelines for heart failure. And you can see here, there's an asterisk for the Class 1 guideline for defibrillators that said counseling should be specific to each patient, should include the potential for defibrillation to be inactivated. This will facilitate shared decision-making. The recent guidelines for sudden cardiac death and ventricular arrhythmias included a Class 1 recommendation for shared decision-making. The National Quality Forum is putting out criteria, or has just put out criteria for certifying decision aids. Actually, Larry Allen sat on that committee. There's been proposed heart failure quality measures for not rate of use of ICDs, but rate of counseling about ICDs, which is pretty different than most other quality measures where they're often just measuring use of something. Medicare's jumped onto this. Medicare now requires shared decision-making in order for reimbursement for lung cancer screening. They require it for left atrial appendage closure devices, and that's one of our contracts with the ACC. They want us to make a tool for their docs so that they can meet this Medicare guideline and do shared decision-making for left atrial appendage. This is a picture from one of our tools. Actually, I'll brag about, we work with a guy at the College of Arts and Media downtown on the downtown campus who has a master's in medical anatomy and does medical illustrations for places like the museum, just does beautiful artwork. We're really lucky to have him in this institution. Medicare just put out a thing that they want shared decision-making to be mandated as part of a coverage criteria for defibrillators. The public comment period for that just ended yesterday. And we were really excited because our tool was actually referenced in their statement as an example of a shared decision-making tool. In the next scope of work with the LVADs, we're actually going to try and write some policy briefs, and we have some policy advisors on can we do the same thing with LVADs, and we'll see. But starting to get into that space and how do you actually influence policy around these things. So I think things are getting better. I really like the Desert Southwest, so I tend to pick pictures from that. But I really like water as an analogy for culture change, where it's kind of slow and over time, but it can really do big things if you just kind of persistently keep pushing it. And I like that. I like that sort of analogy. And I just have so many people to thank. We have an amazing team of research assistants. I just can't say enough about Larry and Colleen and our whole team science culture we have, where we share a lot of the intellectual property, we share a lot of the benefits, and it just creates both a fun research environment and a very productive research environment to get to work with people like I do. With that, I guess I'll stop there and go for questions.
Thanks very much, Dan. That was provocative as usual. Are there questions that the House staff have? I have a question to start things off. I think that there are a lot of small decisions that need to get made in the medical setting, like PSA or genetic tests, as opposed to these life-determining decisions like an implantable defibrillator.
Right.
And I'm just wondering whether the decision-making process and the features that you would consider in terms of educating the individuals and working with the individuals through those smaller but much more common decisions are the same elements as in the life-determining decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. That comes up a lot. And it's in many ways much easier to develop tools for these big decisions. I think most of the decisions are those small day-to-day decisions. I've actually been working with a group at Yale, and they've had this project called Patient Priority Care, where they're trying to have patients, for older adults, they're geriatricians, have patients' goals in the record, and then have all of those multiple decisions that patients make about what type of blood pressure medicine go back to the goals that the patient has. So they're trying a different model for that, but it takes a different model. I don't think you can't have a decision aid for everything. I think that would never work in routine practice. So I think the principles are similar, but I think the practice has to be very different. It's an implementation question again. I think implementing to support decisions in primary care is a whole different strategy and skill.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thanks, Dan. We've heard presentations earlier this year or last year about the importance of including issues pertaining to cultural diversity in your patient educational tools. Did you do that in any of your studies?
Yeah, no, that's so we try to make our videos diverse and representative, but we don't culturally tailor. We haven't culturally tailored any of our tools. And we've done that for a few reasons. Number one, I think it creates an implementation challenge. Once you have a different tool for different groups, you now have a different implementation strategy for each of those groups, and it's already hard enough to get one tool. Second, Dana Alden is a psychologist who does a lot of work in cultural tailoring in decision aids. He's at the University of Hawaii. He presented a study, 3 studies last year at the Society of Medical Decision Making, showing that cultural tailoring in the shared decision space had no benefit. And so we talked to him this year, actually, because I have one of my research assistants is getting her PhD in health and behavioral science, and she's really interested in hospice decision-making in African Americans. And she did 2 African American focus groups and asked, should we culturally tailor? And they said, not only no, but that could be offensive. You might risk perpetuating stereotypes and stigmatizing. And so we asked Dana Alden that, who's been talking about this for years, this year at Society of Medical Decision Making, and he said, I think there's a difference. If you're doing something for behavior change, like convincing people to stop smoking, convincing people to lose weight, the cultural tailoring seems to have a lot of value. If you're at the different theoretic foundation of just trying to make sure they're informed, then maybe cultural tailoring doesn't matter as much and is not as important when you're talking about risks and benefits of an LVAD, for example. But I think it's a good question. I think it's a little bit cutting edge. We haven't, almost for the implementation reasons, but there may be some other reasons not to.
Jeff?
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. What do you do, inpatient or outpatient, when you reach a place of great discordance with a patient? So you're looking at a set of data and you have your knowledge and you have an opinion about it, and they have the same set of data in front of them and they have their knowledge and they have an opinion about it, and you can't seem to see eye to eye, and obviously a lot of these are time-sensitive decisions. What do you do then?
You mean just to even make it more grounded, like the patient wants something and the clinicians don't think they need it? Like the patient and the family want dialysis and the nephrologist doesn't want to do dialysis?
Right, or you think they should get an AICD and they really just don't want one. And so what do you do when you reach that point?
Well, I think those are 2 separate things, honestly. It depends. It almost depends on each. So if the patient doesn't want something and you want them to get it, I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. I think that maybe needs to change. I think we need to be accepting of patients who don't want to get things necessarily. There's no law that says patients have to get things. However, I think that's a communication skill. And I think the concern is, does a patient not, like we interviewed ICD patients and we interviewed a few decliners, and there were some young African Americans we interviewed who said things like, I don't trust the data, I don't think the data apply to me. And I was actually kind of worried about those patients for declining. These are guys who might actually really benefit from a defibrillator, who are declining for the wrong reasons. But I think it's a communication issue for that piece. For the other piece where patients want something that the docs don't think is right, that gets back into that, what options are you even putting on the table? Or how many jars of jam are you putting in front of this patient? If somebody said dialysis is an option, then now all of a sudden it's an option. I think this is part of our job as clinicians to not necessarily even put things on the table that aren't reasonable. That doesn't quite answer your question. I think when you get into those discordance, you get into big communication challenges, and it takes a lot of work. But I don't think you have to offer everything to every patient. I don't think that's what shared decision-making is. I think it's a tough question you're asking, so I'm not really answering it.
Dan, so I was intrigued by the finding that your patients thought that you were still biased towards the LVAD in your decision support tool. Does that have a negative impact on their willingness or belief in the veracity of the tool?
Their willingness or what? I'm sorry.
Their willingness to use the tool or their belief in the veracity of the tool.
Oh, I don't, because they also said nearly 100% of them said they would absolutely or probably recommend it to others, like they liked aspects of it.
But they also thought it was biased.
They thought it was trying to encourage the LVAD. And yeah, I don't know. That's a hard piece that's just a hard piece in the design. We don't want to try and do that. But the other thing we came up with is LVADs have good data. We asked in our ICD tool, is this biased towards the ICD? And patients would say, yeah, it's a little biased towards the ICD. And I said, is that because of the way we're presenting it? Or is that because of the data? And then they said, oh, it's actually, I think the data is good for an ICD. But this is very different than the Medtronic pamphlet that I was given from my clinic. So I don't feel like you're lying to me. I just think the ICD is a good decision. So it's kind of hard to peel even apart what they were answering there. Because LVADs are life-saving. There's very few things we do in medicine that have a number needed to treat of 2,
So 2 quick questions, and thank you, Dan, for a wonderful presentation. First, I may have missed this because I walked in a couple minutes late, but do you want to say anything about the term preference-sensitive decision-making? LVADs tend to be around what are termed preference-sensitive, and I've heard a lot of debate about what counts as a preference-sensitive decision as opposed to a decision that shouldn't be changed based on patient preferences. And then the second question is about the tensions that you mentioned. When you put up the slide at first that said academic business tensions, I was pretty sure where you were going to go with that was the problem of creating a tool that makes it harder to grow your business line. So if 28% fewer people want an LVAD, that is bad for business. And that may not be true at the individual clinician level, but certainly at a program level, at an institution level, some of the types of things that you're talking about in these tools are things that are difficult for the marketing department to wrap their heads around and address when, we're supposed to be creating miracles and being at the cutting edge and saving lives and
right.
And none of the things we do have bad outcomes.
Right. Yeah, so that's a great comment. So the first on preference sensitivity, I actually didn't define it, but nobody wants a decision aid when you're in the ER with crushing chest pain. Hey, do you want your aspirin? Here are the pros and cons. And that's not the right place for shared decision making. I mean, really, you need some sort of trade-offs, whether that's equipoise. There's a lot of work in like early stage breast cancer and a lumpectomy versus a mastectomy. Nearly equivalent outcomes in 20-year survival follow-up. But there's a preference sensitivity. Or you get things with big trade-offs, like an LVAD where there's a huge benefit and there's a huge amount of potential burdens. That's also a good spot for shared decision making. But you need some sort of trade-offs to be preference sensitive. And I think people debate. I do work in defibrillators, but one of the things we're testing in the RL1, I think a defibrillator is pretty preference sensitive for an 85-year-old with non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. But a 50-year-old with ischemic cardiomyopathy, I think the clinicians are going to be a lot less comfortable if that patient doesn't get the defibrillator, if somebody who has a really, really twitchy little heart. So we're actually going to measure that on a per-patient level to kind of see how even within a decision there's a range of preference sensitivity. Because I think that's a good question. The other piece with the business case, I think that's a concern. I think some people have gotten into shared decision making because they were concerned about overutilization. I think that's sort of not a good reason to do it. It gets into the value proposition. I think that's really a fee-for-service problem, right? That it's going to lower the number of LVADs. So as things like patient satisfaction measures become more important to hospitals, maybe there's a better value proposition for a hospital to do some of this. As reimbursement structures change, maybe there's a better value proposition. But I think that's going to be a barrier. And as we go into this next implementation project, trying to implement it all 162 programs, it's actually one of the things we want to look at. How much was that concern about utilization a barrier to them even adopting this at all?
Are the 6 sites continuing to use it?
Oh, yeah. So 4 of the 6 are continuing to use it. One of them is working on it, but has some rules with their local institutional policies about education materials. Has to be branded with their institution. As part of the research study, that wasn't a problem, but as part of just routine practice, they have to overcome that barrier, so they're working on that. And then one side, I'm not sure. I don't think so.
One more question.
Was there a target grade level that you used in creating these materials, or did you find that the language used differed at all from the conversations you would otherwise have in person?
I'm sorry, I just have a hard time hearing you. Sorry.
When creating these materials, was there like a target grade level or some sort of standard that was used for that? And did you find that this differed at all from the counseling you would have done just as part of a outpatient discussion?
Yeah, so the CDC and other places recommend you shoot for a 5th grade level. That's almost impossible when you start putting words like left ventricular assist device, and you look at these reading level things often count syllables and things. So we're at about a 7th or 8th grade level. We do a lot of work trying to get close to that, but it's hard. And it's interesting in the design on accuracy. The patients often want it simpler, but then the doctors want nuance. And I remember I was working with a health literacy person, and my first defibrillator tool called it a bad heart rhythm. The docs didn't like that at all because it would have a value judgment, so it changed it to a dangerous heart rhythm. Little things like that change the literacy level, but those are the kind of tensions in the development that we struggle with.
Dan, thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thanks.